Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Customer Success Skills Exchange. This week, we'll be talking about group hierarchy with SAML and SSO. Our very own Jefferson Jones is here to give us the quick and dirty what we need to know. So, Jefferson, the stage is yours.
Awesome. Well, Solutions Architect, nice to meet everyone, and thanks for joining. There's a lot to cover. I'm sure you're going to have many questions because this is a topic that seems to come around all the time with customers around groups, hierarchies, structures, SAML, SSO, and it doesn't help at all that we have GitLab.com with some limitations and self-hosted with some differences. So things can get really challenging. But what we want to do is make sure that we're setting correct expectations for the customers, because some of these things that I'll cover will decide whether they even choose the self-hosted or the .com offering. So I'm going to do my best to cover as much as I can. I did keep it high level, but we can go as deep as we need to with any questions that come up. So be aware of that. So here we'll start off with a slide deck, managing your ideas. So today I'm going to talk about visibility, about internal, public, and private on projects and groups. We're talking about groups, subgroups, and projects and those hierarchies around them. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, probably a lot about authentication authorization, because I think that's where a lot of the questions are going to come in. As I go through this, please, if you have questions, stop me. We can wait till the end, but I'll try to do my best to pause at moments for this. So today we're looking at visibility, so internal versus public versus private. So there's great references and reasons why we have it this way, but as you noticed within the internal here, internal is only for self-hosted. I think it used to be on .com. They got rid of it for security reasons, and that is no longer a thing. So for .com and important to .com, you have public and you have private only. With self-hosted, you do have this option of internal. So to separate this out, so public projects, as you probably know, they make everything public, right? So if you're on self-hosted and you have inbound internet access from outside, they will be seen if in public. And that is the whole reason why we had the internal. It provides that level of authorization to come in, still be logged in as a guest, but at least it's internal to those teams. And that hierarchy goes to be able to see everything inside of it. Where with private, we have it where it's more explicit access to any group or project that you're going through. And so there's permissions tied to each of these, by the way. And if you look into it further, you'll notice that on a private, guest users have some permissions, and then they do, and some they don't. So just be aware that you'll have probably more guest permissions on internal with more functionality of the capability they can do compared to private, where it will, of course, take those away. So just be aware of that. And I put in, like I said, self-hosted with internet access inbound. This will all be seen. So most customers that I've seen, they either use, internal if they are using self-hosted, and private for .com, as that's really the only options if you're going to do some work. Any questions around this side of it? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward.
I have one.
Yeah.
If I set my public or private at the top level of my GitLab.com group, how does that affect the levels below that?
Yep. So we're going to get in group hierarchy in a second, but it directly affects those. So if you have projects under a public group setting, all of the things underneath said group will also be public. So it is, we will cover that. That is important on that hierarchy. Thank you for that. So here I've combined the two. I was going to separate groups and projects and authorization and authentication, but it seems to make sense when they're all just mashed together like this, since I think everyone has a pretty good idea of group, subgroups, and projects, but I'll touch on that first just in case that's not it. So within GitLab, we have group as the parent group. We have, and I'm going to talk self-hosted here for a moment. We'll just stay in that realm of self-hosted before I go into .com. So with self-hosted, you have parent groups, and you can have as many parent groups as you need. I don't know the limitations of how many parent groups you have, but I do know on a subgroup level, you can only have up to 20, I believe, within the hierarchy. So maybe someone knows how many, if there's a limit on parent groups, but I don't know if there is. So parent group, once again, is that parent high-level group. Below that, you could have projects. So this subgroup isn't needed. You could just have projects from that top level. what we were having though is customers were wanting more flexibility in their hierarchies. And to provide that flexibility, we introduced the concepts of subgroup. So with subgroup, you're able to not only have this group level permissions, but then you can do some overriding or over inheritance from the top to the subgroup level. And so, for instance, if I take a group, you're automatically giving guest permissions at a group level. And then if I wanted to say, oh, well, I don't want, that's great that it's guest, but I want to see it have some team structure within it. So team A, team B, team C, and have more flexibility around those hierarchies. Then I can add a subgroup between the layers. And once the subgroup's there, yes, the guest permissions will inherit from the parent down to the subgroup. But from the subgroup level, I can now overwrite and elevate the permissions given. So guest here, subgroup, I can start making developer and then manage my users and projects via that subgroup. We never recommend to, I never recommend, maybe this is a me thing, I never recommend, managing your permissions around repos within the project or repo itself. It's too granular, it causes too many problems. And for the most part, when managing, let's say you have 500 repos, and now you're adding users at a project level, that can get messy really fast. And there is some limitations right around the API and what you can do there too. So just be mindful that we would never have anyone manage permissions at a project level. Try to keep it at the group level. That's where we want to be, at the group or the subgroup level. That's why we have the hierarchies in place. So I hope we took that down from group, subgroup, and project and the flexibilities that provides and why you want to do that. If not, let me know. And then I'm going to jump into now the authentication and authorization side of it. I messed up. Before that, let's talk about .com. .com is horse of a different color here. So .com, we don't call them parent groups. We call them namespaces. And on .com, within self-hosted, you can have as many parent groups or namespaces as you want on self-hosted. When it comes to .com, you only get one parent group. You only get one namespace per subscription. So if you have customers that want multiple parent groups or multiple namespaces, they'll have to buy additional subscriptions. And that kind of goes where with self-host or .com, they have to use the subgroup structure if they're going to be anywhat of a flexible hierarchy. It's unless they really like spending money on additional namespaces, which I have not seen yet. So just be mindful, it's only one namespace level, and then subgroups. I think limitations still apply, 20 levels, so that should be fine. And then the projects are much the same in that structure. But remember that it's private. Unless they specify it's public, everything is private on the group structure, the project structure, all of that. Cool. So moving into the authentication authorization side of it. So from a self-hosted point of view, we'll start there again. It's hard to dissect some of this. We support LDAP and Active Directory connections. This is at an instance level with self-hosted. So self-host or .com, you can do it per group. So think of the namespace group. For self-hosted, it'd be at the instance level for the LDAP integration and for the SCIM and OAuth. It's all instance level basically. So no group ties there. But there is a way to sync, and I'll show that in a minute, sync roles or groups to roles within the self-hosted, which is an important aspect for management in a lot of ways. For .com, currently all that's supported, we have SAML 2.0 is supported. It only, I believe, works for, there's actually a lot that it works for. We just probably don't say it for support side of it. But I've seen like Jump Cloud or Jump Desktop, I think Jump Cloud, actually be able to integrate with it. Okta, of course, and then we have Azure, which is sort of separate but the same for SAML. With .com, with SAML, if you're only using SAML and you're not using SCIM, so there is two differences there. One, SCIM is like provisioning, SAML is single sign-on. So it's important to delineate that, and we'll have another talk separating those two out. But SAML, just think authentication. SCIM, you can think authentication and authorization in a lot of ways. With the SAML, if you don't have the SCIM set up, users will have to create those accounts, or managers or engineers will have to create those accounts in GitLab before they can have any sort of synchronization with SAML. Self-hosted, when you hook up SAML, it can auto provision those accounts. So it's kind of this weird mess that we have there, but just know that users will have to be created in .com beforehand if they're not using Skim. And what I've seen as a workaround to this, and I don't know if others have seen this too, customers usually have Google Auth or OAuth capabilities. And what I've seen is them actually hook up to the Google OAuth to create the accounts in GitLab and then switch over to SAML, to syncing and linking the SAML. So might be a little trick that could be used elsewhere, but definitely a workaround if they don't have Okta or the Azure capability required. Moving to Skim a little bit more here. So we have Azure, we have Okta. I want you to realize that Azure, there is some limitations as far as what you can do from the provisioning. Like you can create, you can update, and I believe you can deprovision users from Azure. With Okta, we have now in the gallery, or the Okta gallery, their marketplace, we have an application now for Skim available to customers, which is great. However, going back to SAML, we have an Okta SAML application as well, but it's not in the gallery, and this is something they have to configure themselves in Okta. So one application is really available, the other one you'll have to customize build, but we have documentation for both. But just realize they are separate. We are working to combine those into one Okta SAML Skim tool. So LDAP Active Directory only works for self-hosted, right? And then Azure Skim, Okta Skim for .com. So just keep that separate there. And OAuth 2, actually, I don't think there's any limitations on OAuth 2 from a .com standpoint and a self-hosted standpoint, which is nice, but it doesn't do, I don't think you do any user provisioning from OAuth. Well, no, I guess you can from .com. Never mind. So OAuth 2, no limitations that I know of. Notice as I put it up here, right? These connections, all of these authentication authorization connections are at this top level group, this parent group for .com or namespace. You cannot link it to a subgroup, even though a lot of people ask for that. Right now, that's just not what we have. And then, of course, projects, same thing. You can't link it to a project. Really focus on those group structures. Any questions around this? This is a lot to undump, and I apologize. So please hit me with anything you got. I haven't been checking the chat either.
I think this is just more for people who get into conversations about this with customers. If they're asking for .com about Okta integration or any type of SIM integration, they're typically looking for assertions of the provisioning to do a number of things. And if you look at Okta and the list of assertions they typically support or that they have available for different applications, it runs the gamut from creating users to disabling users, which are the two assertions that we support, right through to assertions to provide access at the group level. And that's what we don't do. But a lot of customers, when they think about SIM and they think about integration with the single sign-on tools, that's what they're looking for. So it's be aware and clarify when you're talking to them.
Yes, that is an important distinction. Absolutely it is, because I think the expectation is that, hey, I have Okta or I have Azure, I can centralize manage my users and the roles within GitLab through that tool. And today that is not the case either, right? So there is no group sync. I can't create groups in Okta with certain permission standards and have that linked to roles within GitLab today. They are working on that, but that is definitely something to be called out because I think that people, customers will expect that, and we just say, whoa, it's really provisioning for Skim, deprovisioning, and then for SAML, really single sign-on. Not much group role sync there happening. With that note, though, I do want to kind of take it away from LDAP. So Skim, right? We don't have that role sync. Okta, we don't have that role sync for .com. And I would say that we kind of have it in self-hosted. From a Active Directory standpoint, and this is strictly looking at a self-managed point of view, you do have the capability to LDAP sync the group that you created to the role within GitLab. So it's called LDAP synchronization. We do have it. And I think that becomes more powerful, right? From a self-hosted standpoint, from a .com. .com is very limited in what you can do per role. Here you have that capability. So here I actually have a GitLab OU created with global groups. And so here's my different groups that I've created. I have a global admins group. And so my members of that, which would be various users that I provisioned. And what I can do from there is go into my project. So if I go to a group, so I'm tying it to a group here, and under settings, LDAP synchronization, what you can do is then tie that back. So I can select my AD server, and this is provisioned in the GitLab RB file. I can then select the group that I want. So global admins, as we saw over here, right? And then I can define that to a role, whether that be owner, which probably makes sense in a global admin standpoint, and then adding synchronization, then it will sync those roles to those user permissions. So I think that's what everyone strives for and wants when they centralize manage it. Today, self-hosted is really the only great way of doing it. So any other questions around this? I know, like I said, I know there's a lot going through this.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any advice. Ever scheme implementation for auto provisioning has been problematic. Always have to get customer to reach out to engineering team or support team, go through very lengthy troubleshooting. One client need to change how they map to external ID, and one just does not sync up. So I don't know if there are any additional material that can be shared about implementation of Skim in .com.
Yeah, so Cynthia from the support team actually created a YouTube video recently demoing that. I don't know if you've seen that yet or not.
Yeah, she's the one support the client that we went on for like 5 weeks. So I will check with her.
Yeah. No, so far my interactions with customers around that, it's hard. It's just hard.
Very hard.
And we've updated our documentation to make it more clear and clean and concise. But I have seen it depending on the provider, like OneLogin or Okta or Jump Cloud. Sometimes the details are different than what is expected, and there is some finagling or troubleshooting that has to take place. I don't have all the answers for that. I myself need to throw myself into it and hurt myself to really understand the limitations around that and what to be expected. So ideally, we can jump into that and really start adding some value to the documentation around those. So I may take that on.
Yeah, so we can talk more offline. I can look up Cynthia's YouTube video as well.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, keep going here. So I'm gonna break this. This is just a view of a common workflow that you'd see, right? When using groups in the hierarchy side of it, right? Your parent group, your subgroups, and your limits, your multiple projects. And then of course the functionality that can be contained with each. And you notice it's this kind of roll-up model that we have going through. So I just wanted to glimpse that. I'm sure everyone's seen something like this, but just wanted to make sure that that was touched on. One more thing I wanted to go through really was around the verticals and horizontals of this parent group, subgroup hierarchy. So at a parent group level, just know that they can see all the subgroups below them, right, in that hierarchy. And within the subgroup itself, as you see, there's these verticals that take place. So each one is really its own little namespace or world that it works within as far as permissions go. So just be aware of that. There is some conversations around, you know, I don't want all my customers seeing all my groups and subgroups, and there's this, you know, idea of breaking inheritance that they're working on. And I think those are challenging. Those are really challenging to face, especially on a .com where we only have one namespace to work out of. And I don't think there's great answers around that until they enable that functionality. And I'll share those links as well to those issues open around inheritance and things like that. The only other thing I want to touch on was, and this gets a little weird, is sharing projects and sharing groups. You have the ability, so maintainers and group owners have the ability to share projects with other groups as displayed here. Group owners have the ability to share groups with other groups. Now, we have this thing that we call group lock, and share group lock basically will turn this capability of sharing projects off so that only high-level group owner would be able to do that. But what I notice on permissions is if you turn the share group lock on, that this capability of sharing projects goes away for the maintainer and the group owner, but the group owner can still share groups with other groups. So I know we don't have a lot of documentation around the sharing of the permissions. I did create a merge request to update the permission table to allow for who can share groups with groups and who can share projects. So that should be coming through MR. I think it just needs to get approved. But know that that's a thing, right? And I think that comes into play when we start talking about SSO enforcement, group managed accounts, all that fun stuff that people are now adopting. So here's another example. I wanted to touch on with sharing projects with other groups. I had a customer that came to me, and I guess the expectation was that the issues from the project, when shared with a group, would roll into that group shared with. That is not the case. So if a project issues are doing the work here, and you're sharing that project with another group or subgroup, just know that you're still working out the issues here and not from the subgroup level itself. So a little complicated, but just be aware that that's a thing. And then I have the links here for the share with group lock, sharing with another group, and sharing project with groups. Like I said, all have their own details. And then we have another view, a working view of how to manage users, right? Guest users inherited from that top level, subgroups take over, you can override the guest permissions at the sub level, and then you can share groups between them using group owners. And then of course, never recommending to do it from a project level on those permissions. I think that's really all I had to cover. I was hoping we could dig in more. I'm sure there's a lot more questions that I didn't touch on that I like to touch on. So I'll open up the floor.
We have one question in the doc. Someone would like to know, can a GitLab.com customer change their namespace?
Can they change their namespace? I believe they'll have to go through support for that. So I think the answer is yes, but the only caveat to that is making sure that namespace is not already used from a previous customer. So we do have this dormant namespace action or process to go through. And sometimes customers will want a namespace because it aligns with their name, with their company, and it will already be taken. And so then we'll have to reach out to the person or individual who has that namespace and try to get them to release it if they will. If they won't, then unfortunately that customer will just have to choose a namespace that's not already taken. So.
Other question?
Anything else? Yeah.
I have a couple customers try to combine the protected environment with user group to control who can deploy the code. So it seemed to work, but the deployer not supposed to see the code or do the MR, but those permissions still provided. Is there any way to work around it?
So I guess say that one more time as far as the structure of that. I apologize.
Yeah, so so we will put, let's say, set up a user group, call it deployer. Their sole job is to get approval to deploy to production. And today, in order to deploy the code, either you go into pipeline to click on the menu deploy task, or make automated for the user. But if it's a manual task, the user had to go into a pipeline. So the user who's the deployer had to be a developer role, end up seeing the code, and can do everything. In fact, they're not supposed to touch source code or do MR. So I'm just wondering if there is a way to work around it.
Wow. Yeah, I would say they would probably have to, I would go the route of, if they're not wanting to share the code or you want to see it, it'd probably be best using the API to trigger that, rather than going in the GUI and seeing the code itself. Just an API trigger that's scripted that he can just run the script or whatever it may be.
Okay.
Yeah, I will say, like, the permissions model that we have is, I'm still discovering and learning things, like especially around the shared groups. There's even I slide in here that I'm still having to uncover, where if you're wanting to do groups, like actually put users in groups and then share that group and let that be the control mechanism of who gets a role, there's some complications there as well. So I'll try to do my best to document it all within the slide deck too. Add more notes and information in there of what we find and uncover. But yeah, it's definitely not easy to navigate. I would say that. Just to touch on, I guess I'll continue here for a little bit. I wanted to show you, I'm not sure if everyone's seen self-hosted and how you set up the AD environment. So if you go to GitLab and then GitLab RB, there is a settings in here that you would fill out. You can do multiple AD servers. It doesn't have to be just one. And as I'm showing here, you can enable it with the true. You put in your information around your AD server, the base and group base, kind of what I've showed here. Save that, do a reconfigure, and then you can be able to do that LDAP sync. Here's configurations for Omni Auth as well, and using SAML. And then some of the features there, but all within the GitLab RB file. If you need examples of this file, just let me know. That is all I have.